I like it. I love it. I love that it's small. Again, there'll never be this time again to be able to be this interactive. So I think that that's cool. I want to thank all of the sponsors again, but more importantly, I want to thank you all for working and talking to them. I hope that those conversations are fruitful. I hope that they're going in ways that weren't expected for many folks. So continue to have that. We're all in business. We all have to make money at the end of the day, and we all can help one another. So let's give our sponsors another round of applause. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having this. Which leads me into my next piece, and none of these folks are in here. So they won't hear it. Well, there's one gentleman. There's a lot of staff that helps make this operation work. My production crew, there's a whole back hallway full of folks out there, captains, people watching crazy blue lightning storms coming through to make sure we're all safe and tables won't blow away. There's probably roughly 50 people or so that have been here since Friday helping us set up. They're all running around, and I think they're brown shirts, transitioning in and out 24 hours out of the day. So let's give a round of applause for them. Make it a little loud so they can hear us. We couldn't, we partner with great partners, great companies like the Kalahari so that it's possible to execute, because there's not a lot of us. I can't serve that many eggs. Today's agenda, right? We're going to step out of this. We've got some sessions, we got lunch, we've got some more sessions, open spaces, talk to the sponsors, barbecue. So I know what you heard was blah, 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 barbecue. Barbecue's in a barn. It's a nice barn. And the weather's supposed to be gorgeous. Then there's a little time. Then we have the water park. You have to have that blue wristband to get in the water park. If you don't have the blue wristband for some reason, come find one of us. We'll get you the wristband. Family, kids, spouses, whatever. Everybody come to the water park. It'll be a good time. It'll be a good time if you make it a good time. Yes? Oh, let me tell you something. When you go out, upon leaving this keynote, not right now, okay, don't get up and leave right now. Afterwards, walk out to that window, and you look out, and there's a big brown barn. So how to get to Big Brown Barn is when we decide that we're going to go to Big Brown Barn, we will go down to the second level escalators down, and then out the convention center doors down there, and there's a path to go to Big Red Barn. And you can skip on that path if you want. It will not be recorded, I promise. All right. I told you yesterday that the theme of the things that we're doing is kind of investing in yourself, investing in others to invest in yourself, right? How to have a healthy team environment, whatnot, and then moving into how do we look at how the landscape is changing across different industries and whatnot that we might not be aware. If you heard anything from Tessa's thing yesterday, it's on point with all the activities that happen here. I know it resonated with a lot of folks because I heard the, yes, I could relate, and others who said, I really need to not necessarily do more, but lean in differently than I am today. So now it's about health. Serendipitously, things happen. If I take Tessa's story, Glenn, the gentleman standing over here, anxiously waiting for me to get on, we have meandered through paths in life for probably 15 years now, right? I used to work at Microsoft, he worked at Microsoft, we've just crossed paths in different ways. And I think that it's like her story, things just happened, and now Glenn is here, right? Unplanned in some regards, right? It wasn't like it was planned for 3 years ago. None of this was really. I'm sorry. We started planning this 5 years ago for Glenn, but his schedule is so busy that he has no time for any of us until today. which we're grateful for that he didn't fly Delta because he would have never made it.
Did fly Delta.
He's the only one that made it who flew Delta.
That was also part of the 5-year plan.
Yes. But just because of the way our interactions and things have worked over the years, a conversation happened and now it's here. And I think a lot of Tessa's conversations, a lot of why all this exists, and if you want to call it my success or my things, have happened just by leaning in and doing and not waiting. So with that, Glenn is a fantastic human. Glenn, take the stage. Let's give him a round of applause. Welcome to that conference. From now on, please fly United.
Okay. Let's see if we can get the slides up. Okay. Hey, everybody. Yeah, I wanted to go build off what Clark said about serendipity. So first off, really enjoyed Tessa's talk yesterday, and she inspired me actually to make some adjustments in what I'm planning to talk about today. So anybody who knows me knows I can talk. You're going to get some stories, maybe that weren't planned. They definitely weren't planned 5 years ago because life just changes too quickly. But talking about serendipity, I wanted to call out my friend Corey, who's sitting over there. Corey, Drew, and I have also known each other for a long time, and we met initially, I think, online through Twitter or some social thing, and then we got to meet in person, which is really awesome when that actually happens. You get to meet people in one context, and then you finally meet them in person. Corey and I were chatting on Facebook Messenger probably a couple of months ago, and we hadn't spoken in 20 years. No, it hadn't been that long. But it feels like that, right? COVID, everything feels much, much longer in these days. And Corey was like, hey, are you going to that conf? Now, I haven't been to a conference in 3 years, so I'm actually excited to be at my first conference in person, and I didn't imagine my first conference I'd be speaking at, so that's a double excitement. So Corey was like, oh, are you going to go to that conf? I was like, no, I'm not currently planning to go there. And I was like, but maybe I should. And then she told me that there's a new that conf that's going to be coming in Texas. And so I said, are they looking for speakers? And Corey was like, you should ping Clark. I'm sure they'll find a place for you, which I'm incredibly fortunate and grateful for that to be the case. So I pinged Clark, and I said, hey, Clark, how's it going? And he's like, yeah, great to hear from you. We also hadn't spoken in what felt like 20 years. And he was like, I said, hey, I hear you're putting on this new conference, that conf, and I've known about that conf for a long time, so really cool, and it's one of the conferences I actually wanted to come to. So I said, Clark, are you looking for speakers? He's like, yeah, do you know any? Now, I think he really was wanting me to help him find some speakers. I'm like, well, I know one. And so I proposed to him this idea of giving this talk on healthy software development. And I've been fortunate throughout my career to work on many, many different things and jump into many different spaces. And to the point that Clark said, exploring new opportunities and experiences really helps you to grow. I am a very different person through the experiences that I've had. Corey can tell you, she knows me for a long time and has seen some of my switches. So then he switched it up on me, though. Clark was like, would you like to give the keynote? And I was like, what? And then we started talking about it, and then it was like, sure. He's like, yeah, I think this would be a great topic that aligns with the event. And so here I am. So I think that's a pretty cool story to go from messenger to be standing here in front of all of you, and my first time in person at a conference in 3 years. So thank you all for having me here. I'm really glad to be here. I thought I would start off building off the spirit of Tessa and go a little bit, and especially since I have 90 minutes, tell you a bit more about me and my background and my journey before I get into the topic at hand, which actually relates. So first, I'm Glenn. And my career, I started off coding when I was 7 years old. That was really where my career started. I was a super underachiever in school, but I was coding. And like my family made the mistake of getting me a computer and me having a TV, which was my first monitor, by the way, VIC-20, for those of you who've been around a while, old school. My first computer was 4.77 megahertz. I mean, it was streaming. And I think it had an 8K expansion card. And I used to be up till 4 o'clock in the morning coding. And I was so exhausted when it came time to go to school, which wasn't a good thing. But I just got really, really good at coding. And my dad used to look at me, and he had no idea what the heck I was doing. As a matter of fact, in those days, shout out to Compute Magazine. I'm sure we got a couple of people here who remember what that was. I would spend like 12 hours writing code to get like a graphic or like a sine wave in 3D going across the screen. And my dad used to look at me like I was completely nuts. He's like, why do you enjoy doing that? He just didn't understand it. But what he did understand is that I was passionate about it. And I remember him saying when I was like 10, he's like, that is your future. He was actually right. I didn't even know there was a future. I was just doing it because I loved it. I had a love-hate relationship with coding. My worst one is I wrote a game that I spent 8 months on, and in a fit of anger, I deleted the whole thing. The funny story of that game was it was like a submarine game. I didn't have a lot of money because I was a young kid. I had like a paper route, but I could code. And I saw a friend who got some really cool game on his Amiga, and I wanted it. So I was like, I'll write it. So I started to write. I mean, I was in a little too deep over my head, but I wrote this like really long game and then got really frustrated that it wasn't working the way that I wanted it, so got rid of it. I did end up starting off my career as a software developer, so my dad was right. I did that for about 10 years and then had this opportunity to go to Microsoft. Tessa talked about her journey. My journey is a little bit different. I also got my associate's degree, but I didn't graduate from school. But I was really good at coding, and that got me in the door. And then I continued my career as a software developer and made my way to Microsoft. And at Microsoft was the first time I had a job where I wasn't a software developer. I fell into this product thing. A lot of people, any product managers in the room here or have any experience with product? A lot of people that become product managers talk about an accidental journey. Because nowadays, it's actually becoming a lot less accidental because there are courses and it's like a thing that you go for. But in the early days, it was kind of like you knew the right people or you just fell into the right thing. And I fell into a role which I had no idea what I was signing up for at Microsoft. And then I learned that I just really loved being at that intersection between the engineering team that's building things and understanding what the customer wants. So I pursued that. That led me, and a lot of things happen in our life based on timing. I joined Microsoft at a time when the winds were starting to shift from the Ballmer-esque Linux is a cancer, open source is a cancer, in a different direction. And we know that what's happened now, a lot of big changes happened. And for me, that provided an opportunity to get out in the community and to really start pushing on what we could do at Microsoft to start to open things up. And if that didn't happen, I probably wouldn't be standing here in front of you now. You wouldn't even care what I have to say, because that was really my gateway to just meeting so many people and working on so many impactful things. And also, another thing, aside from coming from this engineering background, getting into product, I started getting in deeply into open source. And so I basically was like tech 24/7. During the day was product, at night was coding, also product, different side of product. And burned myself out, which is a little bit of a topic of this talk. Like, I had no balance. I loved it. I traveled all over the world. I got to speak at conferences like this, but I wasn't taking care of me. And that eventually caught up, and it does catch up. Does anybody here has had that experience of things catching up, and suddenly when it hits you, it hits you. It hits you like a truck. It doesn't hit you like somebody's like kicked you, like you are down and you're not sure what to do. And that was my experience, which I'll talk a bit more about. But another thing that it opened up for me was I started to realize a lot of the privileges that I have as a white male in tech, all these opportunities that came to me that lots of people that don't look like me have not had those opportunities. And I started to become really aware of misogyny in tech, women. I had a lot of women that I met through the community, that I met through working at Microsoft, and they would tell me about what they were going through. And so, and I reflected a lot. Change in our life starts with reflection, and thought about a lot of the things I had done, which I don't feel great about. But you can't change the past, but you absolutely can change the future. If you take nothing away from this talk, one thing I'll just throw out there is something that I've become a huge believer in is growth mindset. And growth mindset is this idea that we can change, we're not fixed. There are the things that are in us, but we can be very different. And what growth mindset starts with is looking at the things in the past, even those things maybe that we're not super proud of, as learning moments. So instead of beating ourselves up and being like, I just can't do that, that's just me, it's like, okay, what can I do differently next time to make it better? And if you do this continually, the person you're seeing on stage is a product of doing that continually over many years. I used to be a very different person who was very fixed in the way I wanted to do things. It had to be my way. Recently, I had a coworker tell me about how I'm like this huge consensus builder. And she was actually pushing me the opposite to say like, no, you're like the VP in our company, like you choose the direction of where we're gonna go. But it actually felt like an honor to have somebody say that to me because I just thought about the person that I was 10 years ago. So we really can change. And so one of the things as I started to have all these realizations was realizing I have power to use where I am to help others. And a lot of people helped me. So the bottom image you see there is a talk I gave in front of a lot of people at Amazon for Cascadia JS on mentoring. And mentoring is something I really believe in. And it is a way for us to help people that don't have the opportunities that we have and lift them. And so I would encourage all of you to use the power that you have to help others. Paying it forward really makes a difference, and it has definitely made a difference in my life. Another thing about me, as part of my exploring different things, wrote a book. I worked on a few pretty interesting technologies, but one at Microsoft that you might have heard of is this ASP.NET Web API, which has done pretty well, and we wrote a book on it, and I used to be a bit of an API fanatic. So this is like all my professional life, and as I mentioned, I was spending so much time, all I was doing was technology, and I realized things need to change. And sometimes life experiences impact us. So I lost my brother 7 years ago. He was slightly older than me. He died of a heart attack. It was a really tough day. But when that happened, and I had to drop everything to step up for my family, to help my family get through this. And when I got through it, I realized I had to change. I realized tomorrow's not promised to me. I realized I wasn't taking care of myself. I was maybe taking care of my social profile and building my followers and building my speaking engagements, but I was not healthy. I was not sleeping well. I was not doing a lot of things. So I realized something had to change. So this is Glenn professional, but let's talk about Glenn who got a bunch of hobbies. So after my brother passed and I was realizing I really need to change what I'm doing, I did something pretty radical. I started to withdraw from a lot of the community stuff I did and started to shift my energy to things that were very different. And so I've listed some of these things here. So one of them is, like Tessa mentioned, I didn't have my degree. And by some crazy opportunity, even though I didn't have my bachelor's degree, I got the opportunity to go back to school to get an executive MBA. And I went back for 2 years. And that has been a fantastic program that really has helped me to grow as a leader. And when I made that decision to go back to school, I said, something's got to give. So I gave up. I had some pretty popular open source projects. I pulled out from all of that. And I'm glad that I did that, because suddenly now I was shifting and getting more balance in my life. So I went back to school, and then I started to pick up hobbies. I learned I love the mountains, so I started getting into mountaineering. So that picture down there is me climbing. We have tons of mountains. Any mountaineers here? Any folks who are into climbing? It's all flat here, so you probably don't have a lot in the area. And then I started getting into rock climbing. And then I started getting into another hobby, which is astronomy and astrophotography. And all of these things took me so far away from what I was doing before. But that was healthy. That gave me mindfulness, presence. That gave me a lot of time to reflect and a chance to really grow. So my takeaway for all of you is have balance. Balance is really important. And it has huge effects, including on your mental health, but it's also going to affect the people around you. In those days when I was traveling all the time, speaking all the time, I was really inconsiderate of my family. I was putting community and technology and career before other people that needed me. So that also has been a great learning. So that's my story. I now work at this pretty cool startup called UpLevel, where I head product. And our product is focused on helping teams be more effective at delivering software, but also making sure they can do it in a way that avoids burnout. So we care a lot about the health of teams. And so when I think about my career, at one point I was working 90-hour work weeks when I was a software developer. I worked in New York. I was heading up technology for a company. My work was everything at that point. And that was one of the jobs where I actually hit a wall. I just didn't want to work. I didn't want to do anything. I was so miserable from the amount of hours that I had been working. So I really resonate with the mission of our company because I've seen what burnout can do and how it affects. How many people here have experienced burnout? A good number. Anybody want to share a quick what that felt like? What happened? Anybody? The quick version, Clark.
Quick version. Am I on? I'm not on. I know we got time.
Teapot calling the kettle black, but you know.
Totally unplanned, but because Glenn leaned into burnout and the mental side of things, and I know the past 2 years have been super hard on everybody about the amount of work and things that's happened. I'm going to take you back to a Microsoft day, and my child was 3. We were working on a healthcare project. I was a consultant. We had a small team. I had pulled 2,500 hours in 8 to 9 months. There's 2,200 hours, 2,100 hours for a working year. I was nonstop 72-hour shifts. That's absurd. I was down a path, a train, life was different, living on Red Bull, but I wasn't about to let grandma die. Class 2 medical device, took over the whole thing. There's no hero in that. We all should have stopped. But the thing that stopped me on that project and ultimately led my decision to go somewhere else was my 3-year-old said, "Dad, why do you not love us anymore? Why will you not come home?" It was the first time that I had worked 20 minutes from my house, and yet I wasn't even sleeping there. It took 3 months before my body was able to function somewhat normally again. It was so bad that the company that I worked for said, "Don't come in for 12 weeks." There's both sides of this house. I tell people that all the time because I missed a lot of first time only. And for what? Guess what? That product never shipped. We found a bug in a device. They had been working on it for 5 years. They couldn't ship it. It was 1 micro milliliter, some very small nodule of a drop of something.
Thank you for sharing that story, Clark. Thank you. Yes, burnout is a problem. It's not new, but we're going to talk about it. But there is something that's new. So we have a big problem now. How many people here have heard of the Great Resignation? How many people have taken part in the Great Resignation? So, good for you. I think I did too, even though I didn't actually think about it that way, the dates align. So, if it walks like a duck, you know the rest of the story. People have been really unsatisfied with their jobs. They've been unsatisfied with their jobs before, but something changed. What changed? This freaking pandemic. The pandemic has been the wake-up call we probably all didn't think we needed, but many of us actually did need it. And during the pandemic, of course, we all know what happened. We were all isolated. Companies were adapting. I think one of the good things that came out of the pandemic, which I think is ironic, is all these companies that were so against remote work, like it could never work. It's just the mindset completely shifted. It was like, we have to make this work. How can we make this work? And I think it started a trend towards remote work that is not going back. And so that's one good thing of all the horrible things that have happened in the pandemic. And I'm sure we've all had our tough experiences, and it swept through my family. And I almost lost my dad, who fortunately I didn't, due to COVID. But one of the things it's caused us to do, I talked about reflection, is reflect. A lot of people are reflecting and saying, hey, what is important to me? What's important to me in my work? What's important to me in my life? And many are coming out of that and saying, you know what? Things have to change. What I'm doing now is not aligning with my why. And by the way, a great book that I recommend, which we read in my program, is Start With Why by Simon Sinek. And that book is more than just about software and product. That book you can actually, and there's like a cult of people that apply that to their lives. Learn about your why. As a matter of fact, my own journey, talking earlier about when I decided I needed more balance, that was also a lot about me coming in tune with my why. What is going to make me satisfied and happy, and what's the footprint that I want to leave on the world? So many are coming out of that and saying, all right, time to go. They're leaving their jobs to find better opportunities that align with their values. This is a good thing. Except for employers. They don't actually feel like that's a good thing. So, let me see, is it showing? Oh, wait. Oh, okay. I got nervous. I was like, you guys have been seeing my slides, right? Okay, thank you. Got really nervous about that. So here's just some stats, right? There's a recent survey. Half of employees are, looking for a new job or planning to. So employers, if you have your people and you think they're not going anywhere, they might just be in the planning phase. It's a wake-up call. But what's interesting is that in the past, comp and benefits has been like the biggest thing. I remember many times, even for myself throughout my career, I wanted to know if it was something cool that I could work on, but number one is what am I going to get paid? That is actually shifting in a big way. Work-life balance, and I think this directly attaches to that assessment people have been doing. They're saying, hey, the money is no longer the most important thing. I want to be happy. And COVID has just been a big reminder for all of us that tomorrow is not guaranteed. And so what we see is more and more people are choosing balance and enjoyment over money. They're saying, I will make considerably less to be at a place where I'm happy. And as a matter of fact, that was part of my switch and what brought me to UpLevel. The other big one is around flexibility. So all these companies I was talking about that were so resistant to go remote, what they really should have been resistant about is people may actually like it. And it's going to be hard to get them to go back. And that is exactly what happened. How many people here have enjoyed, who have been in organizations that moved to adopt remote and flexibility in the pandemic? How many? Good number. And so now that, things are cooling off a bit and, the vaccines are out there and the numbers are going down and people are just moving on, companies are like, hey, we want to go back. We're going to bring it back to the way it was before. But people are standing up and saying, not me. Like, if that's the way it's going to be, I'm going to go somewhere else. And then the companies that are winning are those companies that allow that flexibility, because those are the places where people are going. They're going to those places where they can choose their own hours, where they can work in their pajamas, where they can just have that flexibility. Maybe they go into an office or not, but it's not something. Hybrid is taking off, and there's hybrid where it's forced, and there's hybrid where if you just need that ability to get around people. I'm a pretty extreme extrovert, so I like to be around people. So I'm not opposed to the idea of going in, but I also like that flexibility of being able to work wherever I want. I could also be around people in a cafe. It doesn't have to be in an office. Okay, so that's general for like the entire world, really, corporate America. But it turns out that tech is having the highest number of resignations. So when you look at the Great Resignation, it's actually being driven heavily by tech. And you might say, well, why? Why is that happening? Because tech has historically been a leader in remote work. A lot of organizations already were there, but there were a lot that weren't, that are moving there. And so although it has been flexible, what's changed is the demand is really high on tech workers. And for one thing, this migration toward remote work is being driven by tech. So they're feeling the brunt of how, if you work in tech, and especially if you work in an industry that is offering a service that is going to be used by organizations as they're making that move, and there's tons of products out there, then you're suddenly getting hit with a demand you never imagined. And how do you adapt to that? And what happened is companies were scrambling, engineering teams were scrambling. It was happening both in the big companies and the small companies, and it's still happening. And what's that resulting in? A lot longer working hours. And I saw this because I just came from Microsoft and I was leading a team in M365. And we support just a couple of 100 million customers. And the adoption of M365 exploded during COVID. And Teams, which some have a love-hate relationship with, I will give them a lot of kudos because the product just radically changed from where it was. I'll just leave it like that. And it was a overnight explosion of adoption of Teams, of Slack, of Zoom, all these different tools. So this demand is increasing. And it's causing all of this unsustainable increase in hours, which then leads to what I call the great burnout. I think this is what's happening in tech. Let's see if it's showing the slide. There we go. So burnout, the WHO defines burnout as whenever an environment is creating too much stress that is unimaginable. For many of us, that is our life today. We're just dealing with so much stress, especially if we're at the center of trying to address the demand that is created based on all of this move to remote work, not to mention COVID and all these other things that we're all dealing with, and a lot of the racial unrest in the country. It's just a lot. Burnout actually has 3 phases, just to tell you quickly. So the first one is exhaustion, where you just feel completely depleted. That's where it starts. That's when you're like, oh, I don't want to go to work today. It's too much. That leads to cynicism. And cynicism is where you start really distancing yourself. Now, what does that mean for us on engineering teams? We've all seen it happen. Somebody on the team they're not coming to meetings, they're not engaging, they're starting to care less. Why? Because they're just too overwhelmed, they're too burned out, so they're starting to withdraw. It's a body defense to protect yourself. And then the last place you get to is inefficacy, where you're completely detached. And at that point, people are leaving. But engineering teams start suffering right away Because even when you get to that exhaustion phase, it's going to affect how you function. There's just no way that it's not. It's just going to go downhill from there. So this is a huge problem right now. And so there was a recent survey that was done against a bunch of developers, and this was focused specifically on burnout related to COVID-19. So a really large percentage of people that were interviewed that took the survey were saying that they were experiencing either moderate or great levels of burnout. These are engineers, not just everybody. These are software developers. And a large number said it was increasing due to COVID-19. But then they went further to say, okay, what are the reasons due to COVID-19? Well, the top one, increased workload, which we talked about before. Then there were other things, stresses of COVID-19, uncertainty, isolation, and challenges. I remember this funny joke, it's not so funny, where it was saying, where somebody said, I never thought I'd say this, but, introverts check on your extrovert friends. Some folks that are introverted were loving COVID-19 because, hey, I don't want to talk to people anyway, so I could just, but for those of us like me, we struggled. So, please say a prayer for us. A lot of uncertainty was causing huge stresses. But then they went further in the survey to say, okay, well, in general, what are the things that you feel are contributing to burnout? No surprise on the first one, high workload. Similar to what we saw with what they were saying about COVID-19. High workload was a leader of the pack. But then there were other things like inefficient processes, unclear goals and targets. Anybody here ever experienced that, where you had not clear or reasonable targets, or maybe requirements weren't so great? I'll take that one as a hit on me because, I'm on the product side, we provide the requirements. But then there were other issues related to culture and people, poor communication, unrealistic demands, lack of support. So there's a lot of different things that can negatively impact a team. Agreed? So what makes a healthy team? And this is something we think a lot about at my company because our product, I'll talk a little bit more about it, is really trying to help across the board teams to be able to deliver the software that they're building, but also do it in a way that is both effective and also not taking a toll on the team. So when we look at what makes a healthy team, there's three different components you can look at. One is project health. And project health is the team able to meet its goals? Are there any bottlenecks? Now, this is much deeper than it looks like, because it's not just about the work the team is doing, it's everything that supports the work the team is doing. So, is the build infrastructure broken and slow? Are there, processes that are just not working well? Is the system constantly down due to outages? All of these things are going to contribute to the project health, right? We might be shipping awesome software, but it's constantly down. Well, that's not going to be looked at from a business perspective as success, even though you might have written the most amazing thing. So there's a lot of factors that build into project health. Then there's people health. And people health is really looking at, is the team operating in a way that is sustainable? And this is not really so much about the business goals, it is absolutely about the people. This goes back to what is driving a lot of the Great Resignation. Is I'm just completely overwhelmed with the work that I'm doing. I don't want to keep doing it, so I'm just going to go somewhere else. And then there's the cultural aspect. Are people supported? Are they in a healthy environment? Do they feel, a common thing we hear today is, can they bring their whole selves to work? This is a big thing. We're not just a monolithic set of humans. We're people from all different backgrounds, races, genders, etc. Do I feel like I can actually get my work done, that I feel safe, etc.? I'll talk a little bit more about this. Do I feel welcome? So as an industry, I would argue we've been laser focused on the first. And I'll talk a bit about that. We've spent so much time looking at how do we oil the machine? How do we remove the bottlenecks? How do we ship faster? All these things. We've spent more time on that than anything else. We've also started to spend more time, I would say in the last 5 years, on the cultural side. Like, are we creating the right type of environment? And one place I saw this in a big way was I went back to Microsoft after I left for 6.5 years. And when I was at Microsoft, the first time I was there for 8 years, it was a very results-oriented culture. There was not a lot of room for how you feel, not a lot of care about that. It was like, bottom line, let's get stuff out the door. We definitely cared about impact, and we were doing a lot of stuff I was mentioning, like around open source, but as an individual, the culture was very much about, your results, and there wasn't as much in terms of making sure that you have a supportive environment, which is actually going to help people to achieve the best results. So we've started to put a lot more attention there. Microsoft, just one example. People health, however, is a place I would argue we've invested minimally, the least. And we're going to talk more about that, specifically related to engineering. So we all know about what project health is. Can we ship on time? Do we have the right scope? Are the requirements clear? Are there low defects? Is the system staying up? Do we have the right tools we need? Do we have the right people? Right people is important, not just people, right people that have the right skills needed in order to be able to get the job done. And that also goes into, are we investing in our people by training them so that we have the right people? But that's a different question, and I'll get off my soapbox. So we put so much energy in, as I was saying, to develop and shipping more efficiently, right? With Agile, we learned how to iterate and adapt to accelerate delivering value. Any Agile fans around here? Small A or big A? Which one? Scrum taught us how to work together as a team. It is not Agile, by the way. So whoever told you that, no. They go together. They're not the same thing. Kanban taught us how to develop just-in-time and reduce waste. DevOps, how to be more responsive in developing and shipping software. CI/CD let us automate, ship continuously. All of these things are like oiling that machine of, building software. And then we have other things like SRE, which is a whole cultural change on how we run our software and make sure that it really is attached to the things that our customers care about versus what our engineering teams care about. So we've done a lot in this space. But what about the people? So here's the thing. You can ship incredibly fast, incredibly lean, use all the methodologies in the world, read all the Bob Martin books. I liked a lot of his books. I was a huge Bob Martin fan when I was younger. And you can ship and get a grade A+ on shipping efficiently, but that does not mean it's healthy and sustainable. And that I want you to take away from here. You could be doing the most streamlined processes that everybody's talking about is the best thing. By the way, I used to push this. I used to be so much into Agile, TDD, all these things. And please don't be like, Glenn was blasting Agile. No, I am not blasting those things. I believe in those things still. They're great. But they do not solve every problem. They do not ensure that your people are healthy. And without people, none of those things matter, because people are at the center of all of these things. So you have to be proactive. If you're not proactive, the team can still burn out. You may be going faster, which enables you to take on more work, but then you can just take on too much, which will still have the toll. Anybody experienced that? Has anybody been in an organization that was moving really fast, but they were still feeling burnt out because they were just taking on too much at higher speed? It absolutely happens. So that's what I want you to take away today. If nothing else, efficiency does not mean healthy. You have to care about the people. You have to care about the culture. You have to care about all of these things. So at UpLevel, we've learned this. We've learned that you really have to be looking at the toll that software development is taking on the team. And as we've invested and built out a product that helps here and started to actually get data on it, we can see that toll firsthand. So we need to be looking at the human impact of the work, not just the work and how to do it more effectively. And by human impact, what I mean is what impact is happening on the humans, not what impact are the humans having. Just want to make sure I clarify that. The people. How are the people being affected by the work that we're doing? Without doing that, I can tell you it's very likely burnout is going to happen. So this raises the question of, can we measure people health and burnout? And this is basically the question that we try to answer at UpLevel. And we're using data and data science to help us here. And so what I want to talk about now is what that means. So in our modern remote and hybrid world, a lot of our time as engineers is spent inside tools. Whether you're communicating to get work done, whether you're communicating or you're just using different tools to get work done or deal with issues that are happening in production, everything is tools. It's been great for the SaaS industry because we've moved away from, thankfully, every organization trying to build their own thing to leveraging this SaaS ecosystem and APIs, which, as I mentioned, I'm a pretty big fan of. So you have tools like messaging, issue tracking, source control, calendar, and there's lots of other tools. Well, these tools actually offer clues. When you bring all those clues together, you can get a picture of the people health. And so at UpLevel, we've defined 4 metrics which can be calculated by looking at the signals and these clues across all these tools. And these are deep work, messaging interruptions, context switching, and always on. And I'm going to go more into what each of these are. So, deep work. Turns out that software development is not easy. It requires a lot of mental energy. Does anybody here disagree? It's hard. It needs focus. There's a great book, actually, that you could check out to learn more about deep work, but at UpLevel, we've defined deep work as a 2-hour period of uninterrupted work. So as engineers, in order to be able to get things done, and especially to solve hard problems, to spur on creativity, we need space. We need space where we can just think. Engineers are not the only ones that need this, by the way. I work in product. I need plenty of time to just think. But we're focusing on developers at this point. Anytime there's distractions, that's going to have a significant impact. That's going to affect, how many times have you been in the zone? And I can channel to when I was a developer. Now I pull people out of the zone because I'm the product person. I actually have done that. I had to get better at that when we were in person. That's one advantage of now being remote. You can't just walk up to somebody and tap on their shoulder. How many people have had that tap on the shoulder where you're like right there and suddenly you're like, oh my God. And how long did it take you to get back to where you were? Like hours, days? Sometimes it wasn't until a shower like a week later. You're like, that's that thing. I know when I was a coder, I hated taking notes, so there was no way that I captured that idea that just went through my head. And it's definitely worse if you have ADHD. Okay, so distractions are a big problem. That work needs to be protected. Deep work generally does not happen unless you're intentional about it. So when we look at deep work, it's important to think about what are the things that are not deep work. And these are all things that get in the way of deep work. But that 2 hours, there is actually data behind it. If you can just get 2 solid hours a day as an engineer of uninterrupted time, that has a huge impact on productivity and on your ability to work through problems. So the things that break it, short fragments. like small meetings that happen, because every time you do that, you're out of that place that you were in. If you were in the zone, you're out of the zone. You want to get back to the zone. So short fragments are like small, quick meetings. They're not that long. Then you have full-on meetings, meetings that have more people in them, events that are on your calendar that are busy, but you're not focusing on deep work. And then there's interruptions, which is a big killer. And this is one thing that's become a huge problem as we've moved to remote work, because we all have these great tools that we use where it's so easy to interrupt us. Like we all complained about email. We didn't want to manage our mail, and that's true. And it's like, but the good news about that is if you didn't look at your email, you weren't worrying about it. Now it's like we're always connected. It's so easy to get to us. It's so easy to interrupt us. And as engineers, that really can get in the way. So how can you calculate it? So we look at deep work by saying, one, from a calendar perspective, the meetings that you're in and the meetings that you're attending, all those get in the way of deep work. And then messaging, specifically not messages that are received, because a message that's received that you don't respond to, that's not an interruption. When it becomes an interruption is when you now switch from what you're doing, respond to that message, and go off maybe into a conversation. Now you've totally left the zone. So what can you do about it? And how can it be protected? And I use the word protected for a specific reason. You have to be intentional about it. So one of the things that we found is make it a team sport. So have the whole team set up deep work time where everybody does deep work time at that time, separately. They're all working on each of their things, but they're doing it together. And then you can ritualize it. Do it a couple of times a week, that everybody as a team has that deep work time. And there's a bunch of other things that you can do. This is the killer, another killer. We all know about this, context switching. And a lot of these metrics, a lot of the things that we do all impact one another, so they're tied together. Interruptions lead to context switching, for example. So context switching is literally just jumping around on many different things. The more times we context switch, you lose time on both directions. You lose time when you go to the new thing and you have to get the context to be able to now switch your brain to function on that new thing. And then you lose that time when you come back. And if that context switch was due to an interruption, you lose even probably more time because you forgot that thing that you're hoping you remember again when you were in the zone. The deeper you were in the zone, the worse effect of the context switch. Because it takes time, even when you start off in a deep work type session, before you hit that point where you're like, yes, I am there, and then you get interrupted 30 seconds later. Has that ever happened to you? How often does that happen? It's a big problem. This causes frustration because I'm having trouble getting my work done. I want to do it, but I just keep getting interrupted. How am I going to get this done? But it also leads to burnout, not just from the emotional side, because when you context switch, you often just end up working more time to make up for the time you lost doing the context switch. So it directly has an impact on burnout, which is why we look at it. So with context switching, what we tend to look at is there are some people, and this is important too, we're not all identical. Different people can operate with different levels of context switching. There are some people that actually are okay with working on multiple things. They do better working on multiple things, but not everybody is like that. So it's important to look at context switching more in a relative context than an absolute context. I used to be working constantly on 5 things. Now I'm suddenly working on 10. For somebody else, maybe they only are comfortable really working on 2 things at a time. And people are like this. Our data shows us this. People are like this. I am one who tends to like to work on a lot of things. That's just, and I probably showed up in my profile. I like to do a lot. That's just who I am. But not everybody's the same. So how do you determine context switching? So if you go back to what I was talking about data, looking across all the tools that we work in, because the thing that the tools show us now, they show us when context switching is happening. A minute ago, I was in GitHub working on a PR in this repo. Now I'm spending a bunch of time over here, doing some work on some epics, or I'm working on this thing, or I'm working on that thing. The advantage of this kind of SaaS-based world that we're in now is we have all these signals that if we capture them, they can actually give us a picture of what is going on. We look at things like P1 bug issues because the fact that it's P1 means priority. The fact that it's priority means something that probably happened that needs immediate attention. Some new bug that was filed, you're going to jump. If it's a lesser priority bug, it might have been something that was more planned out. Messaging, we talked about that, which is the interruptions. Those interruptions, as I said, everything is connected. Those interruptions are impacting context switching. Meetings, right? Also impacting context switching. So what can you do about it? How can you get ahead of context switching? One, cancel meetings. Declutter your calendar. Or structure your calendar if you can, especially if there are things that you are in control of, but even work as a team. Maybe say, we're going to agree that these are blocks where we do our meetings. And this is not a thing where it's absolute. It's more of a spectrum in terms of, doing a little will actually have an effect. Success doesn't require it to be 100% across the board, but investing here actually is going to help you. Getting ahead of messaging interruptions, that's really a discipline thing, but it can go a long way. Just resist that urge when a message comes in to immediately respond. And as a team, if you agree to that and adopt that as a culture, then it will be understood, and then you'll actually be helping one another, work together as a team. So protecting people's health really is a team effort. It requires the team to work together. And now let's talk about those messaging interruptions. So as I said before, just because you get a message, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to cause an interruption or a context switch. But let's say you respond to that message. Well, if you respond for a short amount of time, it is having an impact, but it's not as bad. But if you start spending a lot of time and you go off now into a deep conversation, now that is having a major impact. And so although these things can be measured through these signals, there's a lot you can do just by being conscious. Starting to watch for things. There's so many things we do as humans on autopilot. Whereas if you start to be conscious of it, you can see it. We also have a product that will help you. Interruptions impact context switching, which leads to burnout. That's the tie. I talked a bit about this, about the differences. We'll just skip over that. So messaging interruptions are all about messaging. Here we have Slack and Teams. You could imagine other things. Now, what we're talking about here, it's not about the text of the message. It's more metadata. So in our product, we actually do capture Slack and Teams data. And what we're looking at, we're not looking at the content, we're looking at the metadata to see hey, and what we're really looking at is those interruptions. A message was sent, somebody was doing one thing, now they responded, they spent 15 minutes on that. Those are the kind of things that our tools actually do surface that can be helpful in looking at the health of the team. But there's a lot of things you can do to reduce messaging interruptions. So public channels versus sending lots of private messages in private little channels. If things are in public channels, by virtue of it being in a public channel, it is not as strong, it's not really an interruption in the same way. There's multiple people that can look at it, there's multiple people that can possibly address it, and if I'm busy doing something, well, I can take a look later, because if it's urgent, I'm expecting somebody's going to message me directly. The problem when we're always communicating through messaging is there's no difference between urgent and not urgent. Everything becomes urgent when I instantly get a message directed privately to me. So being cognizant of that, having some approach here is really helpful. And the other thing is creating the right types of channels. If you have one big general channel that all the topics are in, then all the people that are monitoring that channel are going to be responding all the time. They're all going to have to read it, process it, etc. But if you start to create specific channels for things so that, hey, if you're not really interested in this thing, you're not in that channel, then that is going to greatly reduce the impact on that person's deep work and context switching. So a few other things here. I'll share my slides. And we actually have a bunch of articles which I have linked to in the back that can give you more details on this. This last one is really big. So we talked about, the number one thing that contributes to burnout is just people are working really long hours that are unsustainable. So Always On looks at the overall amount of work beyond a standard workday. So a standard workday, we define it up level as 9 hours. So if you're doing more than 9 hours of work, doesn't matter when it's being done. If it's in a day, and that is done for, at a high amount for a long period of time, that is unsustainable, which will lead to burnout. And so the problem, and really why we started to even look at all these tools, is today a lot of that work that is happening is just invisible. Like in the old days, when I started out, I used to literally work 18-hour days in the office constantly. People saw me. They saw like the bags on my eyes. They saw that I was ready to jump off a bridge. They knew that I was in trouble. But now there's so much work that is happening in these tools when you're not there, and someone might not even see it. The fact that I'm doing a bunch of PR activity, if somebody doesn't look at those dates, how do they know? So it's the world that we're in, although it offers that new flexibility, is also driving these challenges, which is why capturing these signals or being aware of these tools is really important. So you have to look across all the tools and take all of that time and then say, okay, if you're spending 10 hours, then that's actually going to be unsustainable for the long run. The important thing, too, about these metrics, spikes happen, things happen. People health, when you look at people health, what you're really wanting to look at is what are the patterns? What are the patterns that are going to be unsustainable, that are going to lead to people on the team being, unsatisfied, overworked, burned out, and eventually leaving? So this is the way we categorize it, which is like, hey, up to 30 minutes is okay, like a little bit of time over is fine. But once you start getting to like an hour or multiple hours a day, that is just something that's going to be really unhealthy. Now, we all know people that do this regularly. And it's, if you're okay with doing that and you choose to do that, that's up to you. It is having a toll. But there's a lot of people that don't want to do it and that are forced to do it. And those are the people that are probably going to be the ones that are more quickly going to burn out. But what I can tell you is even the people that used to like to do it can also hit a wall at some point. So even if they think it's sustainable, it's probably not. It just might be sustainable for a little longer than this other person who is like, I'm not doing that. So Always On is just looking across all these different tools. Sorry. And there are other types of tools. Like today we look at messaging, we look at meetings on calendar, we look at PR activity repo activity, Jira activity. All these things give us those clues, but there's other tools people use like PagerDuty, et cetera. You can expand this model across all those different tools. If they're tools you're spending time in, those tools are having an impact to the amount of time you're working. So how can you reduce Always On? So one thing is, there's a couple of tips here. People have different hours, right? So that's one thing, because you have people that are in different, where nowadays, especially as we've adopted remote, people are distributed all over the place. So trying to balance and find those meeting zones so that, this person is not working a bunch of extra hours simply because they're located in this region. These things are not easy, by the way, but if you don't address them, they will have a toll. So you have no choice but to try to find something. Communicating, what hours different people have, so you can then cater to that and be like, okay, and people, we talked about earlier about flexibility today. So even in the same time zone, there may be people that have different preferences of where they like to work. Communication. A lot of the problems that happen in software development are lack of communication. We're talking past each other or we're not talking to each other. But you also have to have discipline. So respecting boundaries as an organization. So one of the things I've started to do, for example, is we use Slack heavily, and Slack allows you to schedule messages. And so, if I get an idea, and I'm often like a workaholic, so, 7 p.m., I know my people are doing other stuff. It's like, okay, if I send it, there's a very high likelihood that at least some of the people are going to be responding. Even if they were doing something else, I'm taking them away, which is impacting their people health. So it's great that products now have the ability to do things like schedule that message. And if your product doesn't, well, write it down somewhere and copy it into an editor and just go, people health, a big part of people health is about respect, respecting those boundaries and creating that type of culture. Another is have an on-call rotation. So things will happen, but at least with on-call, it's not falling on one person, so the load is being shared. So those are all of the people metrics that we look at. And as I mentioned, we have a product up level that actually puts that into practice and allows teams and engineers to all get a view of people health so they can stay on top of it. It does other things. It also looks at project health as well. And we talked about a bunch of things that you can do to reduce them or protect them. So I want to tell you about something else we did which had an enormous effect, and that is talking about the 4-day work week. Has anybody here experienced or works in a company that does the 4-day work week? Awesome. So we're all used to the 40-hour, 5-day work week. And the reality of it is that in modern times, there's a sentiment that it's not really working. And so we need to do something about it. And there's a lot of energy around this, and there's multiple approaches that have been explored. So I thought I'd just take you through a very quick history lesson of why do we even have the 40-hour work week? So at one point back in 1817, people were expected, especially industrial type workers, were expected to work 80 to 100 hours per week. That was the standard. And so after that time, after the Industrial Revolution, momentum started to build for an 8-hour workday. And that momentum built over a pretty long period of time, till 1886, when this 8-hour workday law was passed. And there was a huge resistance. There was a huge resistance where employers resisted. They did not want to allow the 8-hour workday. There were strikes, there were riots. It was actually not pretty. There even were bombs. This is back in the 1880s. In 1926, Henry Ford, he pushed for the 40-hour work week. And he had done a bunch of research that showed that doing more work actually doesn't necessarily increase productivity. We all talk about the law of diminishing returns. I've definitely seen that. In my early days when I was working 90 hours, things that I did past a certain point really were not that great and were more likely to break. If you want a more stable system, work less hours. The more hours people are working, the more likely they're going to make mistakes, the more likely the system's going to be unstable. Shortly after that, the 40-hour work week was passed as US law. So 40 hours, 5 days. So the question then is it actually effective? So a survey was done a couple of years ago, and it turns out that of the 40 hours, only 55% of that time actually goes toward the primary job. A lot of the other stuff is things like meetings, communication, administrative, etc. So what that means is there's a lot of room. There's a lot of room to optimize and be more efficient so that you can still achieve the things that you achieve in the 40-hour work week in less time. And so one of the ways to do this, and as I said, there are other alternatives, is to use the 4-day work week. So 4 days, 32 hours. So you're not packing 40 hours into 4 days. There are organizations that do this. But those who are pushing for the 4-day work week, and you've probably all seen there's been lots of noise about this recently, lots of articles and momentum. So 4 days, 32 hours, 3-day weekend. How many people here want a 3-day weekend? Yes. And that desire for that is incredibly powerful, and we'll talk about that. So we tried it. We've been doing it for about 3-4 months. And this is from Brian, who's my engineering manager. We had very promising results, as many have had who've gone down and tried to adopt the 4-day work week. So one thing is people having that extra time actually resulted in more focus, more energy to get things done, more time to just clear their brains, less chance of burnout. It ties directly actually to each of the metrics I was talking about before. I like what Brian said here. I don't care about the time. What I'm focused on is, are we achieving our goals? Now, are those goals reasonable is a different question, but 100% agree with what he's saying here. It's not the amount of time. The time doesn't matter. It's what's the result for the organization? Are we able to do the things we need to as a company? We found, doing this now about 4 months, I think, the answer is yes. We're able to do that. But what was surprising is we actually were able to do more. So first, it was disruptive when we first got into it. It was a little bit of a shake-up. We did it as a company. I'll talk about that across the board. So it was modeled. I'm on the leadership team. I lead product from the top down. So it was a bit disruptive. But the thing that was really surprising is not only did our delivery volume increase, but we were able to get more impactful things done. And we're a data-driven company, so we looked at data. We looked at tickets and epics and things that were getting done through these periods. We track this whole thing, and we've published a playbook, which I'll share, which is based on that data. And so what we saw was not only were we able to do more, but we were taking on more complex things that we were able to get done. I would argue that that relates directly to the improvement in people's health that this has enabled. People are just in a better frame of mind. They're more focused on getting things done. But there's also the last one. The 4-day work week is not going to be successful if you just kind of stay as things are. You have to go into this. I talked about that growth mindset. You have to go into this with an idea that we are going to be willing to change and adapt. And by changing and adapting, and in agile fashion, doing that iteratively, you're operationalizing and getting to a place that's more efficient. And that's what happened to us. Like we started off and we had some struggles and we actually talked about, what can we do that's better? And we had some ideas. And, ideas are great, but, what happens when the rubber meets the road? And we adapted as we went. It really was true agile fashion. We just kept adapting as we were learning more. And we end up at a place where we're really happy with how things are going. There were challenges, as I mentioned. The first month was really difficult. I found it really difficult. I had recently joined the company and I'm there leading product. It's like now I have less days. I'm excited, but then it's like, am I going to be able to do the things I need to do? Scheduling was really tough because you're now on a compressed schedule. And one thing I'll give as kudos, as far as I can tell, we never scheduled any meetings, like any group meetings or anything on a Friday. Friday was really considered off limits with some exceptions, which I'll talk about. And so although we adopted the 4-day work week, that didn't mean no one worked on Friday. And there were two patterns there. One, we're a SaaS product. Tons of organizations are depending on our product. Tons of engineers are depending on our product to get their work done. And guess what? They're not working 4-day work weeks. Maybe some of them are. And actually, some of them are interested in what we've learned and like, okay, we want to try that. But many are not. The business has to still operate. So we had to do some trade-offs. We had to, and going back to some of the things I talked about earlier, we introduced rotations. Support is a great one. Something happens on a Friday, how do we treat it? And so we had to do some triaging and prioritization to say, okay, if it meets this certain bar, yes, we're going to take care of it on a Friday because it's going to directly impact our customers that are not working a 4-day work week. But there were other things where we had a lot of flexibility to move, and rotations was key. So although I would argue in a modern SaaS company, it's not going to be 100% equitable because of the fact that you're in the nature of your business, things are going to go wrong on Friday, that something's going to need to happen. But then there were a lot of people that chose to work Friday, usually only for a few hours, to get ahead of things. They found that was the perfect place to have deep work because they knew they were not going to get interrupted. We were really good, by the way, on Slack. Like, there were very, very few messages that ever went on a Friday. And so that really gave people the space. I found that I needed to start using that Friday for that deep work. There were big things I was working on that I just didn't have the time to do. So the way we looked at it was, we're not going to tell you you can't work. The difference is you're not expected to, barring when those support issues and other things come up, which we all agreed on, and in those cases we used rotations to try to balance that. So a key thing I think about our success is the way that we rolled it out. We did an initial launch meeting, and it was across the entire company, and we're small. We're now at about 35 people. We're an early stage company. At the time, I think we were around 30, but it was a group conversation. We all got together as a company and talked about this, why we were going to do it, and leadership made it clear from the top that we are committed to this. But we presented it as an experiment. So we gave ourselves a way out. We said, we're going to try this out. We're going to commit to doing this for 3 months. We're going to see how it goes. If it's going well, we're going to continue. If not, we might go back. But it's transparency. We were completely transparent about that. Everybody understood going in what the goals were. And if they didn't, they were able to voice those concerns. And then what we did was have a half-day hackathon. This was really cool. Had a hackathon where we said, okay, imagine now we're a 4-day work week. What does that mean? What are the things that have to change? So I think the key thing is, although it needs top-down support and buy-in, the whole company, well, it's probably hard in a really large organization, there needs to be a lot of ownership below the leadership in figuring out how we make this work. There has to be autonomy for the company to work together based on what's best for each team. And so that's what we were able to do through this brainstorming. And the other thing that we did, because we're a data-driven company, is we created a bunch of surveys that we used for tracking. So we basically had surveys, and those surveys, everybody was involved in putting together the concerns that went into those surveys that we would use to get a sense of, is this actually working? So we looked at things like, how do people feel? Do they feel refreshed when they come to work on Monday? Do they feel stressed that they're not getting enough work done? We didn't know what we were going to find out. But what we found out was, even with the challenges, everybody was like, this is better. We heavily adapted and operationalized. And this is the thing I think is most exciting. We canceled a lot of meetings. We're like, we just don't need this. So I think people are like gases in this way, and engineers. It's like, whatever space you have, you'll fill it up. So we had things that were like, yeah, but now we're compressed. We don't need that. Let's get rid of it. We consolidated some things and said, hey, we don't need 2 meetings. Let's do 1. A big one was things that were an hour by default went to 30 minutes. And I can't tell you like how powerful taking an hour meeting and moving it to 30 minutes is, because it just pushes that laser focus, and we saw that. And we did a whole ton of other practices which have been documented in that playbook. So it was a lot of work. But the thing is, we adapted and got to a better place where this is actually working, where everybody in the company wants this to happen. And we created so much goodness in the company because people were using that extra day to do so many things, from going out to the mountains, like me, to, errands. Like a cool thing was a lot of errands and things that people had to do naturally just moved to Friday because they knew that was their free time to get that done. So my theory on this is that the desire to have that free day is just an incredible motivator, more than money. That everybody wanted that ability to have that extra day because that free time and that flexibility is so important that people were just incentivized in ways that calling for people to do stuff just never would have had that effect. The internal motivation was there because people wanted that free time. And watching that happen has just been amazing. Okay, so I guess I did pretty good at using a good portion of the time. We are planning to continue doing this for the end of the year, but we've left it open. So we still have said, hey, if it ever gets to a place where this is not really helping us, we'll do something, we might consider going back. But what I believe is, based on the operationalization that we've done, if we do go back, we're going to be in a better place regardless. And I don't see us going back anytime soon. So there's a lot of great stuff out there on the 4-day work week, and there's actually an organization specifically formed, I think it's called 4dayworkweek.org, for companies that are going down this path. And the other thing I'll say is, the idea of the 4-day work week didn't start from our leadership. It was actually something that started through something that was an idea that some of the devs had. So I say that to say to all of you, you can have power. If this is something that's interesting to you and learn more about it, start conversations. There's a lot of data out there that is showing that this is a model that is gaining more and more traction. It is also becoming a big attractor to hiring. People look at two companies and it's like, oh, maybe this one pays more, but this one gives me off every Friday. So it's really valuable. The last thing I want to talk about, which I didn't give enough time on, is culture. There's so many things that you can do to improve the culture of an organization, but there's a couple that I want to talk about that I think didn't always get attention, that are getting a lot of attention today. And one is empathy. And empathy is really just learning to understand, having the interest and desire to understand what is important to the people around you, what matters to them, their experiences, not looking at everybody the same way. A lot of the problems that have happened in our industry are because of lack of empathy, because we just assumed one way. And this gets into a lot of bigger topics, but it literally every one of you can have a difference, make a difference here by just being empathetic. And all it just means is having curiosity to understand the people that you're working with. Get to know them, talk to them, find out what's important to them. Don't guess. But also, don't assume that there's one standard way that everybody on the team is going to work. There's been some great studies that were done with at Harvard around the power of teams coming together and forming their own norms. And one of the things that teams forming norms enables is empathy. Because the norms that come out of the team that they agree on are based on what are the things that are important to everybody that's on the team. And another topic, which I'm going to mention a bit more about before I run out of time, but I'm going to mention it here, is when we look at people that don't look like us and understand that their experiences are different. One of the things I talked about, my own level of privilege that I've come to realize. And in the past, I would look at everything from my lens. Empathy is not about looking at everything from your lens, learning about different people. We see, one of the things I hear as I've gone out of my way to meet more people that don't look like me, and especially more black people. We need more black people in this industry. We need more people of color in this industry, but the place where we're suffering the most is lack of representation from African American or black people in our industry. I'll just say it. It's true. But it's not going to, it's our responsibility to make those changes. And it's our responsibility to be empathetic, to create those environments where people from different backgrounds are going to feel like they can do their best work and that they don't have to match up to standards that don't align with their own experiences. This is really, really important. Transparency, sharing with one another. Organizations can do this, but teams can do this. Don't hide things. Work with one another. Be clear. And if you're a leader on a team and you're being pressed on something, talk about why. And another thing that goes along with transparency, which I didn't put on this list, is vulnerability. Being vulnerable. It's not about us being these super strong, stiff boards. Actually, the more effective teams are those that share with one another, that are vulnerable. But to be vulnerable, there has to be trust. And to be trusted, you have to warrant that trust. So when I talk about things like empathy, if you're not empathetic, there's people that are not going to trust you because they don't feel that you value their experiences. They don't feel that you value what's important to them. I'm not talking about tech stuff here. I don't care about what library you're using and all that. That stuff is important. I have spoken all over the world on that stuff. This is a thing that if we do it, is going to help our industry in so many ways, and it's going to help the world, really. Autonomy. Engineering teams, healthy engineering teams, need the ability to solve their own problems. They need support. We need support. But we need that autonomy. And that is something that we can create. We can create it within our own teams by saying, this is the way we're going to operate. And of course, organizational leaders can do a lot here too, to create environments that promote autonomy. But again, you have power here to ask for this. You have power to go to your leadership and say, hey, we want more autonomy. You definitely have that power. This is another big one that goes along with empathy, which is psychological safety. Psychological safety is really that, and there's a great study that was done on this, but basically the idea that you're in an environment that is safe, where you can be yourself, where you're not worried about retribution, you feel, and what the data has shown is that when teams are psychologically safe, they just accomplish so much more. Amy Edmondson is the person at Harvard who coined the psychological safety term. And she defined it as a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. One thing I think that's important that goes along with this is the idea of a blameless culture. Psychological safety is that, hey, when problems happen, I'm going to feel safe with reporting those problems because I don't think that there's going to be the act of me reporting the problem that I'm going to be blamed for it. But the other thing is that when you don't have a blameless culture, people are shutting down when something happens because they're worried that they're going to be the one who's going to get the axe. So focus on how can we create an environment where people feel comfortable speaking about the things that they're seeing so that it can help us be better. That's it. Here's a bunch of resources that you can get some more information on some of the things that we talked about, including the 4-day work week. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
There is time if a few minutes. If people
I
have
told
any
you.
questions.
I told you that was going to be shorter than you thought. Hey, do we have any? Let's give Glenn another round of applause. I think this is an important topic, very important, which is why I asked Glenn to actually put it on the big stage. But before I kick him off, does anybody have any questions, thoughts, something they want to share about this?
I'll throw it on. Glenn, you mentioned about scheduling messaging, trying to control when you're communicating with your team, etc. How do you balance that concept with we want the team to have the freedom to work when they want, right? Like, it seems to be two different messages, right? One is there are sacrosanct hours that we consider work hours. The other is work when you want, right?
Repeat the question before you.
Sure. Thank you. So I think the question was that on one hand, we're talking about flexibility for people to work the way that they want, and then the other, we're talking about how to protect on messaging. So a lot of this is gray, of course. You got to try different things and see what works for what organization. I think one of the things is if you're in a distributed team, especially if those teams are located in many different regions, there are challenges. So coming up with common hours and then respecting outside of that is one way to do that, and I've seen that work. Like, here's a core set of hours that we all work, and outside of that, then we respect those boundaries. Some teams don't have that problem because they're all located pretty close to one another. So what I would say is for the teams that are actually located kind of in the same area, it's usually easier to address that. I think the other thing which we talked about was other strategies you can use, like just the types of channels you create, or not doing things as private messages, which also will help. It's a good question, and I think a lot of these things, it really does depend on the organization, but you absolutely can, with intentionality, make progress there. Yeah. Does that help? Yeah, it's a good question. Yes?
As you've moved to a 4-day work week, has there been any pressure to change compensation?
No. And that is, okay, so the question was, as we've moved to a 4-day work week, was there any pressure to change compensation? I mentioned how at the very beginning we rolled this out and we talked about the intention. The intention was never to change compensation. Because again, the theory is you're going to actually get the same amount of work. If you focus on the work and the goals and the things that are being achieved for the company, the hours are not the thing that's important. And I think that's what's central to the 4-day work week. It's a great point. Now, an interesting one, when I posted about we were going down the path of the 4-day work week on LinkedIn, was somebody said, what about contractors? How does that work for contractors? It's an interesting one. I think for us, they're not included as part of the 4-day work week because contractors are paid hourly. That's the business model. So, yeah, that's the way that is. But as a contractor, if you optimize and you can get more work done in less hours, sure. But, and of course, if you're ultra efficient, maybe you can negotiate to change your rate. And it really wasn't an issue for us, so I'm just kind of spitballing here. But it was an interesting one. You know, in terms of curiosity, when someone raised that question to me, I was like, I didn't think about that. But for us, I'm happy to say, and I would strongly recommend for any organization that goes down this path, if you start taking the money away, that is going to, you know, I remember I talked about that super motivator of getting free time. It's the idea of getting free time and getting the same amount of pay. That is the strongest motivation. If you start pushing on the comp side, the motivation is going to be less. Because then it's like, oh, well, then I could just work 4 days and make less money. Like, I could probably do that now. So, does that make sense?
I'll add on to your point. We work with a couple companies who are the 4-day work week, and it's changed how we work with them because we've got certain delivery dates and things that we need to have. So if I've got to get something off to print and need it designed, whatnot, I have to be more mindful of my schedule. And we get in some situations where, you know, shit does happen on a Friday, they're not there. How do we kind of react to make sure that printers have their deadlines and whatnot? So the exceptions that you talked about at times and whatnot. I mean, it's on both sides. So,
Yeah, and we've been very cognizant about our customers. Some of our customers, we've told them, so transparency, we've told our customers we're a 4-day work week, and sometimes if they try to meet with us on a Friday, we will push back and say, like, is this really important? If it's critical, we'll probably do it, but what we find out most times is those kind of meetings are not things that couldn't be moved out to the next day. It's more like it's the end of the week for them, so it's easy. So I think it's important to do that because your customers will come with you. What we found is as long as they know that when they really need us, we're going to be there regardless of if it's a Friday or not. The other thing I guess to mention, which I think work really well, some companies have done the 4-day work week where it's up to you to choose the day. From what I see, I'm not a fan of that approach because all the operationalization that we did was really tuned around the fact that we're all working the same days. I think that can be really challenging. But one thing that a lot of companies do, like Microsoft, for example, doesn't have a 4-day work week across the company, but a lot of organizations like M365 have no meeting days. And that actually has a lot of value if you stick to it. It's one thing to say it. And I remember when I was in M365, they would say, even if a CVP calls you at a meeting on a Friday, your CVP gives you permission to say no. Well, not everybody's going to do that. Doesn't matter if your CVP told you. They're going to be like, oh, is this person going to like ruin my career because I told them? But I will say that when I was in M365, we did a pretty good job of it, and it definitely made a difference, but it didn't make the same difference that the 4-day work week does, but it certainly helps.
one more.
Yeah.
Not a question, but a follow-up. So at Microsoft, or CXP, we actually do have Fridays.
Yep. No meeting day.
And we've actually been given that same permission.
Yep.
Everything from CVP
Yep.
to partner calls, we can say, sorry, Fridays are no meeting days because that's our chance to catch up. And pretty much the only exception to that is if there's extreme escalation, which is remarkable.
Yeah.
We follow that model and it actually works really, really well for us.
Yeah, that's really awesome. One of the things that we did on my team was we had a game day. It's another cool thing that you can do to just help with people's health. But it was on the no meeting day though, and I was kind of like, it's like it's not a regular meeting, but it's still a meeting on a Friday. This was not at UpLevel, by the way. This is one of the other companies that I worked at. So I would say if you do those game things, like don't do it on that day when there's no meetings, because the whole idea is like if you know you have that no meeting day, you can plan completely and you can just focus on exactly what that thing is. And it's like, hey, even though game days are fun, it can also be a bit of a context switch. So yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you all.
Let's give that another round of applause. Just as a reminder, this is recorded. It's out there streamed right now. We will record it and do the things, or it is recorded. We'll do the things. So if it's something you want to take back, share with others. I think we all have to take, just like I told you to take the step to be part of the community, you have to take the step to be for your own health and whatnot, right? You're in charge of making that change. With that, got 15 minutes or so before the next session. Enjoy the day. Glenn's around. Talk to him.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
You